Time for adventures.
Ta-da!
Because we have one of my personal heroes, I have to admit, in the games industry, who is American McGee.
You spent like half an hour telling me about the other day what a fascinating life this guy had.
I love his games. I love his, especially Alice, American McGee Alice. It's one of my favorite games. But I enjoy so much every time that I meet with American, just listening to his stories, right? As a creator, first working for amazing companies in the US, then moving all the way to Asia.
He's starting his career with John
Carmack, who randomly met one day, and Carmack invited him to the fantastic team of id Software, doing games like Doom and Quake. But then he moved to one of the top companies, of the biggest companies in the games industry, Electronic Arts. Then from there, he went to Asia, wandered around a little bit, ended up in Shanghai, founding his independent studio.
So you could say if American McGee was a superhero, he could have like many powers.
He would be like the whole league of superheroes, I would say. He has
American League.
Very different skills. And I didn't mention, he's running a very special game jam. If you know what is a game jam, it's like a kind of a camp where creators get together to do games for a short period of time.
The Pirate Jam.
The Pirate Jam. He does this game jam. He does this game jam in Thailand, in a boat, sailing around Thailand. So that's amazing. I want to go there next year as soon as the pandemic allows us to travel.
For sure.
And we wanted to talk to American to learn a little bit, not only about the way, his vision about games, but also about his experiences in life. And who could I invite it better than Noel Llopis to talk with him about it?
Yeah, because Noel Llopis, not as big, but also he had a quite quirky, adventurous, unique career.
Okay, thank you. And good morning or good afternoon, American. How's it going?
Yeah, I'm doing good. Thank you, Ivan, for that nice introduction. And hi, Noel. Yeah, I'm doing well here in rainy Shanghai.
Right. 6 hours apart we are here. So, like Ivan said, I wanted to talk to you about your amazing and colorful career. It's been a very successful but very unique kind of career. And I think we're tying all of this under the umbrella that one of the things that made that possible has been your very diverse skills and adapting to the situation. So I think I'm just going to start chronologically, but I definitely want to be tying in that particular theme as we get to it. So just to start from the very beginning, what's your first memory of games?
Yeah, well, I can't say I necessarily started off like a gamer because when I was a kid, we were playing games on relatively primitive gaming systems like ColecoVision or the old Atari system or a Magnavox systems. So I do remember playing those kinds of games as a kid, but I never really had any sense of connection to the making of them. Even later on in life, I began to get very interested in computers. I was a nut about Commodore 64s and the Amigas, and I would make things that were kind of like games on those. I would play games on those. But again, I never really thought about it as a pathway. In fact, when I was a kid, I was very much obsessed with and interested in becoming like a Jacques Cousteau or a Carl Sagan. So while I knew there were games out there and I had some exposure to, and I even tinkered around with making some in programming, I never thought that was going to be a career path for me.
That's very interesting. It's definitely not the usual, I would say. I think a lot of people, when they encounter games at that age, it kind of becomes a passion. So right away, that to me, that's pretty interesting. So you go from that, and then next thing I know, suddenly you start working at id with Carmack. How did that happen?
Yeah, well, it was quite sudden for me as well. Actually, leading up to that point in life, at around the age of 16, I was a high school dropout. I had been going to a magnet school in the US, so it's kind of like a special school for talented and gifted. But I sometimes think they put us all in there because we were all very unruly. Anyway, the focus there was about computers. So I continued studying engineering and computer at that time, but there were events in my life that led to my not really having much choice but to drop out of high school. And I then went on, worked a variety of very strange jobs, but settled down working on cars as an auto mechanic. And at that same time, I moved into an apartment complex and I met John Carmack, who also happened to be living there. Now, he used to come home driving a Ferrari, and I would come home wearing my overalls from working on cars all day covered in grease. And so it felt like we couldn't really be further apart. But somehow we met and we really clicked. And in fact, we did play games together. We would play Nintendo games together and we would meet and watch movies. So somehow there was a friendship formed there between myself and John. And that eventually led to my being invited to id's offices to test play Doom, which they were working on at that time. And that eventually led to being invited to come to work full time at id. And that, of course, was an opportunity of a lifetime. Now, when I started by answering the phones and doing tech support, but that eventually led to the career that you're aware of and working on Doom and Quake.
Very interesting. So then the connection with Carmack was mostly video games. It wasn't cars, since you were working on cars and he had the Ferrari. That it really wasn't from that angle. It was more like the video games and playing together.
The idea of playing video games together, kind of, but I mean, more than anything, we just sort of became friends and started hanging out. There was actually a group of us. He wasn't my next door neighbor, which is as it's sometimes written in the history of all this, but he was the next door neighbor of my friends. And, I lived a few doors down, but there was a group of us there who were friends. And it seemed that he was sort of reaching out to try to have a social life outside of the office. And that included going to see movies and playing games and having dinner and things like that. So the initial, I think it would be difficult to say that it was just video games that drew everybody together. But of course, just like when people hang out, games were there. Right. And then, of course, we pretty quickly discovered that, oh, wait, this guy, the reason he's driving a Ferrari, we thought he was like a mysterious private investigator type, because he was driving the Magnum PI. He was driving the Magnum PI type of Ferrari, and his license plate said ID Tech. Well, we didn't know that was id Tech. We thought it was like ID Tech, as in I'm a investigator, right? So for a while, he was a bit mysterious about that stuff, and then he finally opened up and started to invite me and others to the office to play the games.
Very cool. So you started you said playtesting Doom, and then you started doing tech support?
Yeah, I think, that'll remain one of those mysteries, sort of one of those instances where I felt like I was struck by lightning, that John, I don't know, did he take pity on me, or did he see something in me, or did he just want to try a bit of a social experiment? But, he reached out. He took me to dinner one night and he said, I'd like to offer you a job working at id. Now, I accepted it, and that made me the 8th employee of the company. That included our receptionist, Donna. So it was a very small company at that time. And I became, at that point, someone who was there to answer the tech support phone calls on Doom. But I sort of quickly understood that that wasn't going to be a position that was going to last very long. But yeah, I mean, John took a big risk. I suppose he saw something, and I hope it paid off. I'm still actually to this day trying to kind of repay and live up to that that opportunity, that honor that he extended to me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Very cool. And then looking at your career, the next thing you're doing is actually you're designing levels for those games. How did you go from tech support to doing that?
Well, like I said, I kind of knew that we weren't going to be able to run the entire tech support division for id Software for very long. I mean, that was a fast growing, very rapidly, becoming famous and successful company. So I started playing around with the level editor almost immediately, the moment I was in the door. And that was partly because inside the company, look, if you landed at id Software as a high school dropout with a little bit of programming skills, and you've got a John Carmack there, you're probably not going to take it upon yourself to go and push into the programming, the tech side of the business, right? And the same went for the art department. That was fairly well, filled out. Kevin and Adrian working there knew what they were doing. They were top of their game. But level design was, in fact, a sort of constantly evolving and new art, because we were building the tools to build levels as we were building the games. And there was no notion of, remember at that time, there was no notion of like what a 2.5D or a 3D level built in one of these engines was. So to pick that up and to learn it wasn't being presumptuous on my part. It was like nobody was a level designer in that particular tool or engine. And so I think that gave me a sense of, confidence that, hey, I can give this a shot. And it worked out. I turned out I was quite good at it. And I built a lot of content for the Doom and Quake games and a lot of level packs in between.
Very cool. Would you say that some of your computer skills and experience in programming came in handy for that level design? I mean, you still had to do some scripting and things like that, right?
Yeah, for sure. So, that's where I sort of came into my own at id, was that I began to combine together a number of skills that I had from previous experience. One of them was programming, which then led into my working on and doing a lot of the Quake C code, whether it be the functioning of doors or the firing of a rocket launcher. And at the same time, I had a big passion for music and sound, and that transitioned into being put in a position where I could go work with the guys at Nine Inch Nails as they built music and sound for the game, and then come back to the office. And I was like blessed with this ability in this space where I could build a level, I could write the script to make the things happen in it, I could attach the sound effects that I had worked on with the guys in New Orleans, and I could integrate the music, and I could have a lot of really interesting creative control over what was going into these levels. So I think that was a sort of glory time for people who were able to mix all those sorts of things together, because later on the industry went into highly specialized roles for the development of big AAA games. So yeah, it was a lot of fun, and my disparate skills coming together there really served me quite well.
Right. And you mentioned music. Was that something you had some experience with before, or is it just something that you learned on the job? Music and sound effects?
Well, so I was playing music as a kid. Nothing very sexy. Well, I guess it depends if you think James Galloway was sexy or not. But I started playing flute as I think I was in like 5th grade or something. I later got into playing other instruments, and like these days I play cello, which is sitting back there. A lot of that stuff self-taught, but I'm a big fan of music and of a wide genre. And the same thing goes for sound effects. As a kid and growing up, I always was messing around with little tape recorders and making sound effects and things like that. So we one day got a fax. I mean, that was back in the days of faxes. We got a fax that was from Nine Inch Nails saying that the band will be in Dallas this week, and they'd like to invite you to come see the show. And I was beside myself because I was a huge fan of Nine Inch Nails, as was John. We would be in the office late at night just blasting Nine Inch Nails and Marilyn Manson. And, you can feel that in the games. I mean, that was a kind of sympathetic energy that was going on at the time. And that invitation came across, we went, we met them, everybody gelled really well. And it put me into this crazy dream slash, I don't know, it was a very wild position of being able to go and collaborate with these guys on sound and music. So, I mean, it's hard to draw a connection between, being a geeky kid playing flute in middle school to going out and being on the road with Nine Inch Nails and, putting a nail gun in a video game some years later. But it all had its purpose, it all had its reason for being there.
Right. So about how long did the id stage last? Was it like 3-4 years?
Yeah, I was there for 4 years, and then I was fired without much explanation. But it was an interesting thing because I was at once devastated because it was the best thing that had ever happened to me, right? But then after not very much time reflecting on it, I was actually quite relieved because I suddenly felt that I was set free, not to, sort of speak ill of the past, but the culture there had become quite difficult. And I didn't realize how difficult it was until I was fired. And then there was this sudden and very strong sense of relief, but, initially was kind of muddled up with shock and surprise at what was happening. So 4 years there, and then a very sudden termination. But the termination set me free. It led to bigger and better things.
So what did you do? Like you're suddenly fired from id, and what happened?
There were a couple of job opportunities. I actually went and worked with John Romero at his company, Ion Storm, on a small project. I just focused on doing sound effects, actually. And then I got a mysterious summons from North Carolina, which turned out to be from Michael Crichton, the film writer, or the author and film producer. And he was working on a game. And somehow my name had come up, and they wanted me to come and consult on it and help with game design. And then that led to EA showing up one day and saying, we're interested in this game, we're interested in funding it, but we'd like you, American, to switch teams. Come over here, work for us at EA, and we'll continue our involvement with this Crichton project. But as that happened, and I took the job at EA, the situation in North Carolina just sort of kept getting worse and worse, to the point where I went to EA and threatened to quit if they didn't cancel the project, because it was something that I felt wasn't going to end well. It wasn't going to sell. It wasn't going to work. And so EA canceled it, which severed my friendship with Michael Crichton. That was sad. But that project did, it shipped, and it's not funny that it failed, but it shipped, and it did fail quite terribly. And I think that sent some sort of signal to the higher ups at EA that, hey, this guy's willing to call it like it is. He's not afraid to put his foot down when he sees something isn't going right. And so because of that, I suddenly found myself within EA being sent around the world to work on a number of different projects, providing oversight and also bringing feedback to the executives to sort of say where this project was and whether it was going to work or not. And all that was good for a while until I finally said, look, this isn't creative. I'm not creating anything. I'm just kind of going around being sometimes kind of a hitman. And so then this was another time where lightning struck, where they came back and said, what do you want to do? Do you want to make a game? What game do you want to make? Which is what led to Alice.
Wow. So I'm amazed at two things there. Like Crichton would just reach out to you personally. Do you have a common acquaintance, or is it that he was interested in your experience as a level designer, or why did that happen?
Yeah, I don't know if I would characterize it as he did that personally. I mean, there was a video game company that was making this game, and I believe it was the guys within the company who but Crichton had a very close association, maybe even some sort of ownership association with the business. It was very surreal because on the flight, on the plane to go to the meeting, I was reading a novel. The novel happened to be called Travels, which is the sort of semi-autobiography of Michael Crichton, right? And so I went into this room and I had the novel there on the desk, and he walks in and says, "Would you like a Coke?" And I'm like, looking at the back of the book, I'm like, but he was great. We got along really well. He was actually very inspirational to me. He really kind of pushed me and nurtured me on becoming more creatively active, becoming more of a storyteller, and being around him to see how he went about the process of creativity. Because it's not like a flash out of the blue, right? Creativity is something you have to work at. You have to train yourself, and you have to have a process. And so seeing his process for what happened before he sat down to write a story, and being in the brainstorming sessions where he did that kind of stuff was phenomenal training. So, even though at the end I cut myself loose from that, I still was able to take away a lot of interesting knowledge.
Right. And then there's the other amazing thing, which is EA comes, well, not comes, so you were already at EA, but EA offers you this opportunity to say, hey, would you like to make a game? It's kind of like this dream situation. So how did you react to that? Did you already have a bunch of ideas? Did you have this one idea that you wanted to make? Because Alice came out of that, right? So how did that happen?
Well, I mean, in terms of the reaction, that for a high school dropout, my reaction system was already being burnt out by a continual series of, bizarre events and meetings and rubbing elbows with all kinds of strange people that, I think for a long time I would send emails or call my mom and say, I did this, I did that, I met this person, and she'd just be like, "Oh, that's sweet, honey." I don't think she actually believed any of it. I think she I think she just thought I was living in a sort of weird fantasy world. So my reaction to it was, again, honored, and a mix of kind of trepidation and also excitement, because at that time, I did have very strong feelings about the kinds of games that I'd like to make, having come out of id. Id was notorious for not having much story in their games. Sort of like they'd make the game and then they'd get to the point where they had to write the copy on the box, and they'd be like, "Oh man, what's the story for this thing?" Right? And then they'd write some bullshit that came up in the last week before the game was shipped, right? So I very early on started having a sense that, man, these could be really excellent storytelling mechanisms. If you look at my level design, I often built story beats and kind of acts and sequences into the level design. I thought that was really important. But that was a big no-no at id. And so when the opportunity came up, my first thought was the technology can shine if it's wrapped with a package of story and a universe of art. And so I just started kind of racking my brain and talking to my friends, trying to rattle some sort of idea out. And as I've told the story several times, I was actually, I think I'd probably heard or thought of Alice in Wonderland at this point, but I was on the Highway 1 going down the coast of California, and this song came on, and the word wonder was at the start of it, and that it just triggered in my mind. I was like, a dark Wonderland, something about Alice being dark and moody and violent. And I went back and we just started riffing on it. I had an art team. We started coming up with character renders, and it just sort of formed up by itself.
Very interesting. The moody and dark almost seems like it's an influence from your time at id, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing that's a little bit strange, I guess. Maybe not. I mean, they say that opposites or likes attract, and opposites attract as well, I suppose. But everything attracts. I think that I have had in the past, my life, there's a lot of chapters of it which are quite dark, which is one of the reasons why, for instance, I would have been listening to Nine Inch Nails naturally while working on Doom and Quake, and how I ended up working on Doom and Quake and having the kind of past that I did, where that sort of violent, visceral gameplay would have been very appealing to me. Who knows, right? But that similar sort of thing happened with Alice. That I had in me a dark story to tell about childhood, and here was this vehicle of a young girl in a surreal, fantastic world, and all I had to do to start to tell the story was murder her parents. And so that's what we did. That turned her story into a canvas that was suitable for me to kind of get out a lot of the ideas and thoughts and emotions that I'd had coming out of my own childhood.
Right. So you mentioned storytelling being one key different point about Alice from the games you had done before, and maybe even a lot of games that were done before, just in general, up until that point, did not have a very strong story. How do you feel about storytelling in games in general, especially in the game medium?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good to see it, but it is like all forms of art and entertainment. There's a range and there's a place for it, right? I'm not a story purist who thinks that every game has to have a story. It just happens that I like to tell story in game, but I think in many cases, a story or a clunky story can get in the way of a good game. And I know that in a lot of instances, even when a game has a good story, I also like the types of games that have areas where the world becomes a sandbox and you can go off and either make your own story or you can just be nonsensical. You know, this was one of the things that I really appreciated about Grand Theft Auto 3. It was the first time I felt like there was a game that gave me the opportunity not only to write my own story, but just to be pointless to some degree. And yet it also contained a story, right? So I think it's got its place, and I think you have to be, careful not to let that become like the overriding factor for why a particular game exists, unless that's the kind of game you're trying to make.
Right, right. So one of the things that stands out about Alice, just by looking at the title, is that it's not just Alice, it's American McGee's Alice. How did that happen?
Yeah, well, that was another instance of sort of being hit by lightning. That time hurt a little bit more for a variety of reasons. Mainly, it was that EA Legal, in doing what EA Legal has to do, needed a trademarkable and protectable namespace, right? So whenever you're inventing a product, you've got to make sure that you're either not violating the space of someone else that's built something similar, and or that there's not so much stuff out in the public built around that name that it could create confusion and someone could come and claim some aspect of the thing that you've built, right? So with Alice in Wonderland, it's quite difficult because it is a public domain property. And so I know that the legal guys spent a lot of time trying to figure out, could this be Alice in Nightmare Land as an example? But obviously at that point, many people had dreamt up Alice in Nightmare Land, sort of like trying to find a clean and available domain name, right? So they came to me at one point and said, we'd like to stick your name on the box because it solves this problem. American McGee's Alice. No one's going to come and say, hey, I'm also American McGee. Stop making my Alice. So, this was sort of the double-edged sort of having a strange name and being involved with a project like this. And so I said, okay, I signed the piece of paper. You can use my name. But when I went to tell the team, they weren't happy. And they talked to me and I understood their concerns. So I went back to EA and I said, hey, this isn't great. The team has told me they're not happy about it. And the lawyers said, okay, we'll figure something out. We'll get back to you. And then I got a message, we're not going to put your name on the box. And then like a week before we were supposed to ship, I got a message, your name's on the box. And so I had to go to tell the team, look, I fought, I tried, but at the end of the day, I had already signed this piece of paper and they made their decision and that was that. And for better or worse, the damage was done. The sort of momentum of that has carried forward into lots of other projects. And I think I mentioned to you before, there's even been instances where I've had publishers say, we'll give you this deal, but only if you agree to put your name on the title, right? So it's kind of a blessing and a curse, I suppose.
Interesting. What was your exact role in Alice? Were you like, would you say the equivalent of a movie director to the game, or did you specialize in something more in particular?
With Alice, it was similar to what I'd been doing on Quake. So ultimately, I ended up being, I guess you'd say, the creative director, co-writer, but I also engaged with Chris Verena on the music and sound effects. I also made some sound effects. I also integrated sound effects into the game, and I built some levels. I did a wide variety of things, and that most of it, a lot of it, took place while I was still in Redwood Shores, and then I would go to visit the team in Texas from time to time. But in the last couple of months of development, I went there and stayed with the team until the game was wrapped up, and continued working on a variety of things from writing to level design. And then when the game was launched, it was multiple weeks out on the road doing PR tours around the world and being sort of the point person for this new project. So a lot of variety. But again, that's the kind of thing that I like.
Right, right. How big was the team roughly? I mean, at that time, teams weren't huge yet, right?
Yeah, no, Rogue had an office in a kind of strip mall, shopping mall area in Dallas, Texas. And I think at that point, when I met them, they were the same like id. They only had about 6 employees, and then they slowly grew to 9 and 10. And I think for Alice, they probably had something on the order of 20 people. So it wasn't a huge team, but 20 people, 2 years, and they produced pretty good chunk of good content.
Right, right. And that also explains why you were able to sort of get involved in so many different aspects of the game. Cool. So Alice launches, you go on a PR tour. What happens afterwards? Does EA want you to make another game right away?
They did, but they fired my creative partner, so I quit. So my relationship with EA ended quite suddenly. I was not happy with the way they treated RJ Berg, who was my creative partner and co-writer on the Alice game. He had been an employee of EA for, I think, going on 14 years. And they just decided one day, hey, buddy, you're laid off. And off he went. And I thought that was a very terrible way to reward somebody who had just shipped a game. So my response to that was, if he's fired, I'm quitting. And they shrugged their shoulders, and so I left. After that, I decided to move to Los Angeles because Hollywood was calling. We'd had some Hollywood executives or film producers or something who'd come and seen Alice, and that resulted in going and having a meeting with Bob Weinstein of Miramax Dimension. I think that's the brother. It's not the one that got in trouble. So I'm sure they're both leches. But anyway, again, a very surreal moment, to go, having been a fan of a lot of Miramax films and Tarantino and things like that. And suddenly I'm sat in the office and there's Bob Weinstein and I'm pitching him on my Alice. And he slams his fist down and says, "We're buying it," and just weird, just very strange. But that resulted in me getting what was called an overhead deal with Miramax. And so I was paid. I was paid quite well to come up with ideas and to also kind of ride along on the process as they tried to make the Alice story into a film. And I also signed up. I was doing TV and film work for a company called Squeak Pictures. So of all things, like I spent a year working with Madonna and going to Kabbalah class with Madonna because she wanted a music video based on the song American Life. And I was supposed to be the one to direct that. And so the idea was a video game / music video that you could both play and watch on MTV. And I remember I went again. I went into the bathroom. I'm like, I'm in Madonna's bathroom, and I texted my mom, I'm in Madonna's bathroom. Oh man! So that was Hollywood. I mean, I lived in Hollywood for 4 years. It was a very bizarre life. I sold a couple of film projects, never got anything really done. Finally, kind of just burned out on it and decided to leave.
And where did you go from there?
So I went to Hong Kong. I'd been working on a game that was my attempt at a kind of social commentary around the issues that were existent and still very prevalent in the United States. In fact, as you and I record this, the US is embroiled in riots and protests. So this game called Bad Day LA was my attempt at capturing a lot of the emotions that I had, because at that time in the US, we also had, just suffered 9/11. We'd gone off to start blowing up Iraq. We had police violence. We had overcrowded prisons. We had social injustices. We had all kinds of crazy stuff going on. We had a culture of fear, and we had a media that I felt was really addicted to violence. And so I thought, again, given an opportunity to make a game, I thought, well, these guys over in Hong Kong, they're not going to tell me that we can't make a politically motivated video game, which, by the way, in the US is quite hard to do. And so I wrote up a story, and we started making that game. So that gave me an entrance. Those guys eventually invited me to come and live and work in Hong Kong. And I did. I went there for 2 years. I worked on the game for a year. And then I spent a year writing a script for a film based on my Oz concept for Disney Bruckheimer. And meanwhile, I was going in and out of China, mainland China. And I was just seeing this crazy land of opportunity that, like, a lot of people just didn't have any notion to go to. They had no sense of what China was, I mean, growing up for me as a kid, it was like red China, it was a scary thing. And my mom would say, racist stuff like, eat all your food. There's starving kids in China. So it again was one of these bizarre things where I kind of try to pinch myself, like, what am I doing in Hong Kong? And I'm traveling up to China and meeting with like famous film directors and personalities there. But yeah, that was the transition from Los Angeles to Hong Kong.
Very interesting. So what things in particular noticed were so different about China that you like so much? I mean, you mentioned it was like the land of opportunity, which I'm sure is surprises to a lot of people listening to this.
Yeah. Well, when I was growing up as a kid, my mom was a big Asiaphile. So we had all this sort of Chinese and Japanese styled furniture. And she had a lot of art and books and things like that about China. So it's sort of weird. Like I've actually told my mom it's probably her fault, because that I had an attraction to Asia, and maybe that I had an attraction to Asian women, because she had this collection of stuff, that from the perfume that she wore to the house dress that she wore to the furniture. There was all this sort of faux, China, Asia, Japanese stuff going on. Now, I had been traveling to Japan quite a lot for EA and working on projects there. So I had exposure to Asia, and I had been to Japan quite a lot, like a lot. And I thought, hey, I'd like to live in Japan. And I was actually offered an opportunity to move to and live in Japan, and I passed it up. And that was a decision where I just kept kicking myself afterwards. Monthly, weekly, I'd have some sort of bad experience, and I'd think, oh man, I should have taken that job in Japan. That would have been adventure. That would have been fun. So when the Hong Kong opportunity came up, I jumped on it. And when you get to Hong Kong, like, one of the first things you realize is hyper capitalistic. It's hyper competitive. It's hyper money and hyper manufacturing. It's just, it is probably the most capitalistic place in the world, and it's this gateway to China. And then as I went into China, I started to see, like, oh man, these guys are ramping up. This is about to just take off, because there was so much investment going into the place to build infrastructure and to train people. And you could walk down the street and just have like government guys come running out being like, hey, you want some free money and an office and some students and no, don't pay taxes for 10 years. And I'm not joking. It was just nuts. You could get all these sort of gifts handed to you to come to China and start a business. Now, by the way, I never took any of that, because I don't believe that if a business can't be sustained on its, I believe that if a business can't be sustained on its own, you shouldn't run the business, right? You should have self-sustaining business. I'm not a big fan of handouts, but just to give you a sense of the kind of the feeling of opportunity that was prevalent in China at that time. And yeah, so, I moved here, and it has been all of that and more. I think, the whole world now knows the story of the transformation, the epic, unbelievable transformation of China that's occurred over the last 15 years. And I just find it incredible, and I feel blessed that I actually had an opportunity to be here, to be engaged with it, and to witness it all firsthand.
Well, yeah, I mean, you had the opportunity, but you also had to take that leap, right? Of saying, I'm abandoning this place that I've lived all my life and I'm going halfway across the world. I mean, that's not a choice that a lot of people would have done. So that probably set you up in a different path.
Well, so that kind of goes back to the thing where I mentioned about getting fired from id, because getting fired from id was the first time that I realized that in crisis and chaos is where we always find the best opportunity for growth, right? I had become lazy and numb at id, and I had become kind of unaware of myself. I was living in a state of unawareness, and being fired woke me up. But you don't have to be fired. Sometimes you can throw yourself off that cliff, metaphorically. So in the instance of deciding to move to Hong Kong, it was exactly that. I got the offer. I sat there for 5 seconds and I thought, this is totally crazy. I'm terrified out of my mind to do it. Do it. And a month later, I was living in Hong Kong. By the way, when I arrived in Hong Kong, when I got to the apartment, there was this sort of like month-long adrenaline of selling all my stuff. I had a going away party. I flew. And when I arrived, I remember the first night there, and I cried because I was scared. It was like, oh my God, what have I done? I left Madonna behind. What's going on? So it's, but I've learned to take the sense of unease, and that's a good signal that you're doing something right. You're pushing your own boundaries.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Was the language a problem? Were you able to get by with English, or you learned some Chinese? How did that work?
Well, this is a problem about Hong Kong, is almost everybody there speaks English, but if you force yourself, you can learn Cantonese. And so I sort of wasted the first 8-10 months where all my friends said, oh, you don't need to learn Cantonese. It's totally useless. You'll never use it. But then going into my second year there, I had moved off to this remote island in order to sit and write every day on a film script. And on that island, not everybody spoke English. And so I was, I'd better learn a little bit of the language here. How do I go buy some garbage bags or something, So I started to learn, and then I liked it. I started teaching myself all this stuff. I really liked it. And then when I started traveling into mainland China, having spent a year training my ear on the tones in Cantonese, and then beginning to try to transition into speaking Mandarin, it was really helpful. That was one of the reasons I picked up playing cello, because it's a fretless instrument and it's all about tone. And I found that if you're studying a tonal language like Chinese at the same time that you're studying a fretless instrument like a cello, that your brain, you can feel the folds forming in your head. So yeah, it was something that I taught myself. And these days, my wife is Chinese. Her mother lives with us. We speak Chinese in the house all day long. And it's just a necessity of life. And so it's, yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. So tell me what happens afterwards. You move from Hong Kong to this island, and then what happens?
Well, then I got a call from a company called GameTap, and they wanted me to build a game. And they wanted me to stick my name on it. But that one string attached was it, because I said, well, I think I want to go build the studio for this in Shanghai. I don't have a studio right now. Now, normally, if you tell a guy who's going to write a check that you don't even have a studio yet, they'll just laugh and walk away. But these guys said, okay, so I moved to Shanghai, and I started hiring up. Now, fortunately, I had friends in Shanghai by that point who also were in games, they were in outsourcing, and so they were connected into the scene. They had me come up to the local GDC chapter and give talks. So I had some cards and I had some contacts. But I came up to Shanghai and I put my sign in the ground and I said, this is me. We're going to make this project, and this is going to be our culture. Who wants to join? And I think I had mentioned to you before, in the time, obviously, of my time in the US, I'd gotten to visit a lot of game studios. I'd got to see a lot of cultures and processes and looked at why things went wrong, where they went wrong. And the same thing when I started going into the studio in Hong Kong, and then I started visiting the outsourcers in Shanghai. There was a lot of knowledge in my mind about like how, if I was going to build something new, especially in a blank canvas space like China, I might do that to be awesome. How I might make it geared really properly towards creativity and the health and happiness of the employees. And so that was what I did.
Very cool. How would you say, give me some examples of things that were different about the culture of the company you created, mixing a little bit, the Chinese culture and what you learned in the US?
Yeah, so one of the things in the US that I think still happens was crunch culture. And so I had a very big sense of like trying to stay away from the concept of crunch. I didn't want our teams to suffer through crunch, and that I understood that proper process would be a good way to avoid crunch. And so I built the studio from the ground up with an agreement between myself and the employees that, look, you're going to be micromanaged. It's going to be pretty significant micromanagement of your time to sort of a half-hour increment. But in return for micromanagement, I'm going to promise you that you never have to work overtime and you never have to work on the weekends. So that was something that was instituted that a lot of people told me wouldn't work. They're like, you're going to have crunch. But we managed to make it work.
That's great. So do you think it was a successful approach? People were happy with it and it worked well for the games?
Uh-oh. I feel like our connection is very sad right now. You sound like a robot.
You sound fine to me, so I'll try it again. Do you think that approach worked well? Was it successful for the games and people were happy with it? I'm
sorry. More time. I just rebooted my VPN and I think you're better, but let's try one more time.
Okay. How do you think that approach worked? Did it work well for the games, and were the employees happy with that approach?
Okay. Yeah, so we managed to survive for 10 years. And in that time, we managed to get out Grimm, which was a major 2-year project, and Alice Madness Returns, which was a major 2-year project, plus a handful, maybe 8 or 9 other games of various size. And some of them online only, some of them multiplayer, some of them mobile, some of them PC. We had a very happy group of people working for us because of the emphasis on their happiness and on the emphasis of a creative space for them to work inside of. I also felt that we were very efficient at converting capital into content. So, in other words, you put a certain amount of money in and some amount of assets and artwork and gameplay comes out the other end. And for China, and also I think just for the world in general, we were very efficient. And we were efficient in that respect in a way that defied what everyone else was doing in China, because where a lot of people came to China, they would pay incredibly low wages and they would have lots and lots and lots and lots of employees. I wouldn't do that. We were paying US wages, if you want to call it that. And we had very small teams. So the idea was we would hire small teams of only the best people we could get, pay them a living wage, more than a living wage, not work them overtime. And the result would be better content and more throughput. And it worked. And it worked to the massive surprise of all of our competitors in China. We used to have people come by who'd see how small our teams were and be like, you're lying. I don't believe you. I think you've got like another 100 guys stashed in the back room there. And then I'd show how much we were paying to these employees that we did have, and they'd be like, "Oh, you're insane." And I'd try to do the math for them, like, well, look, 300 employees times cheap is the same as 30 employees times expensive. You understand that, right? And they, yeah, I get that point, but I don't believe that your 30 guys can actually do more work than my 300 guys. So anyway, that was a big aspect of why I think we were successful and why our employees were happy.
Right, right. And at this point, were you personally involved with each game as a creative director, or were you more overseeing the company process as a whole?
Both. It depended on the project you're talking about, but for Grimm, for all these projects, I had to run the company, and my degree of involvement with running the company was up and down. But there were times where we had investors on board, and so I had a lot of investor-related duties. And then things like making Alice Madness Returns, we had EA to contend with, right? So they require a lot of service, and then also the way that project was structured. It was like a film in terms of the financing. It was a bond financed finance structure, which meant we had a bond company to answer to, and they had to have their regular updates. But all of this meshed quite well with the way that we were kind of a clockwork, process-driven studio. So I still had my hands in a lot of things, but certainly I wasn't sort of sitting down and making sound effects by myself. I wasn't sitting down and writing code or building levels by myself. At that point in my career, it was very much about writing, about creative direction, and about running the studio. So
Right.
it was a big transition. Yeah.
And then after a few years of this, you kind of shift gears completely and start a project with a very small team, which is your current Alice Asylum, I think it's called, right?
Yeah, well, after 10 years, which would have brought us to 2017, I think was or 2018, I can't remember, but Spicy Horse parts were shut down and parts were sold off, but it ended. And I ended my relationship with it about a year later. So yeah, I then started up a number of different things. One of them was Pirate Jam, which is the game jam in Thailand on the sailboats we can talk about later. And the other one was the revival of the Alice series via something called Alice Asylum. And that's using Patreon as a platform for sort of empowering. We've got a team of 8 artists. And so our patrons are the ones that lend the support that make it possible for them to work on Alice Asylum. And it's been a really good process because it's very collaborative with the fans. Like we do something we call crowd design, which is, I'm the designer writer, the buck stops with me, but a lot of the ideas and a lot of the concepts that we come up with for the game, those are gone. They come from the fans, or they're bounced back and forth with the fans.
That's super interesting. And the Patreon approach is only for pre-production, right? Like once you have a game kind of ready to go for production, then you need to look for funding elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think we've got what is considered a fairly large Patreon channel in the game space. I think we're somewhere in the top 10. But even with that level of success, I did the math once. I think that using only Patreon money, it would take us 30 years to fund a new game at the level of money that we spent, say, on Madness Returns. So it is possible for it to power a small team of, sort of part-time work for hire artists to do the pre-production work. But by the time we need to actually pull the trigger to build a full-blown game, keeping in mind, like Madness Returns, Spicy Horse, when we were developing Madness Returns, we had 80 or 85 employees internally, and we had something like 280 or maybe 300 external artists and tech people and a whole bunch of other skills. So that project, it pulled in like 300 people for 2 years straight. So and that doesn't count the 2 years prior to that we spent with dozens of people on all the business development and all the finance structuring and things like that, right? So As wonderful as Patreon is, you know, unless we suddenly woke up one day and we had 300,000 patrons instead of 3,000, we're not gonna be able to get that rocket to take off like that.
Right, right. That's a super interesting approach. We're running out of time, but I want to ask you one last thing about the Pirate Jam. Can you tell us
Sure.
what it is?
Yeah, so one of my passions is sailing, and this goes back to when I was saying I worked on cars, you know, and my love for Jacques Cousteau and the ocean. So I'd always dreamt of sailing, and being that I'm quite mechanical and I know how to fix things, and I'm not scared of a diesel engine. You know, I was very attracted to sailing, and so I have a sailboat. It sits in Thailand, and I thought I'd combine that with my love of games and the games industry by inviting game developers out to this thing dubbed Pirate Jam. Now, the first year was just 2 boats, my boat and a friend's boat, and we had 6 developers aboard the 2 boats, and we spent, you know, 8 days or 9 days out sailing around and making games. This last year, 2020 Pirate Jam, which was the 4th year of Pirate Jam, we were scheduled to have something like 24 people joining us aboard 7 boats. But at the end of the day, a bunch of people dropped out. So it ended up being only like 13 people on 7 boats. But it's still fantastic. We were on the water for 10 days. They made tons of games. You can go see the games on itch.io. And they have a blast because, again, it goes back to pushing them out of their comfort zone and like getting them into a place that they wouldn't normally be. And a lot of them have come away from the experience kind of shocked by how much it's changed them to engage their creative process out in such a kind of unusual space. You know, so it's working quite well.
Right, right. Very interesting. And again, another example of combining some of your previous passions and skills into something new. So very interesting. So I think we're out of time. I think Ivan wants to take it back to the plateau. Okay.
Thank you so much. It's been such an amazing series of stories and in the career of American, as we expected. And I was thinking as I was listening to you, American, that if I had to make a movie out of your life, your mom would be such an important character there, and I couldn't wait to see the encounter between Madonna and your mother, and just talking about.
Yeah, that would be very funny. Absolutely,
so fun. It was super fun, super interesting. Thank you so much for sharing your experience with us, American. Hopefully, we can meet again soon in Shanghai, like last time we were there a few years ago, having fun. Hopefully, we can get together maybe one day in Asturias with Noel. And once the situation, you know, gets better, hopefully. Okay. So thank you very much.
Sounds great.
Once again, it's been a privilege to have you both, and we continue with the program next. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.